hockey sticks, wine, cement. Those three words, sitting side by side in an official White House list, tell you almost everything you need to know about how strange this trade war has become. On July 20th, 2026, President Donald Trump signed 3 separate proclamations imposing an additional 50% tariff on a wide swath of Canadian goods, using a law that hadn't been invoked in nearly a century. 2 days before this recording, that tariff was still a threat on paper. As of right now, it is less than 48 hours from becoming reality, and negotiators in Washington and Ottawa are working through the weekend and into the week trying to stop it from landing at all. To fully understand why this specific announcement landed the way it did, it helps to place it inside the larger year of tariff escalation both countries have now lived through. Canada was among the very first economies targeted when Trump began his second term in January 2025, when he invoked emergency powers to declare a national emergency over fentanyl trafficking from Canada, Mexico, and China. That authority, along with a separate and much broader worldwide tariff regime, announced that April was ultimately struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in a 6-3 ruling in February 2026, which found that the underlying statute never actually authorized the president to impose tariffs of that kind in the first place. Rather than ending the tariff war, that ruling simply pushed the administration to search for other legal tools it could use instead. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 for a brief global tariff that has since expired, Section 301 investigations into forced labor enforcement affecting dozens of countries, and now Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, dusted off for the first time in generations specifically to target Canada's auto, alcohol, and dairy policies. Each of those tools operates under different legal standards, different exemptions, and different procedural requirements, which is part of why this dispute has become so difficult for ordinary businesses and consumers to track. A genuinely new tariff regime seems to emerge every few months, built on a different section of American trade law than the one before it. Let's start with what actually happened on July 20th specifically, because the mechanics here matter. According to the law firm Butzel Long, Trump used Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a Depression-era provision that authorizes the president to impose duties of up to 50% on goods from a country found to be discriminating against American commerce. Reporting from Kiowa County Press quoted a senior White House official telling reporters on background that, to the administration's knowledge, Section 338 had never been used for this exact purpose before, and that it had sat essentially dormant since the 1940s. The official argued the statute's language was clear. It applies whenever a country treats American goods worse than it treats goods from a third country. On that basis, the administration built 3 separate proclamations, each targeting a specific grievance. Al Jazeera's breakdown of the White House fact sheet laid out the 3 pillars plainly: alcohol, dairy, and motor vehicles, which the administration says Canada has treated in a discriminatory way compared to how it treats other trading partners. The scale is real, but in the context of the overall Canada-U.S. trading relationship, relatively contained. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, citing the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the new tariffs apply to roughly $20 billion of Canadian imports, about 2% of the $382 billion in goods the United States imported from Canada in 2025. The same reporting noted that Washington has pointed to a $4 billion U.S. goods trade deficit with Canada in 2025, driven mostly by oil and gas as part of the broader justification for its trade posture, even though oil and gas exports themselves are explicitly excluded from this particular tariff action. That's an important detail, because the exemption list tells its own story about what this fight is really about. According to trade compliance guidance from GHY International, the Section 338 tariffs specifically exclude energy products, potash, fish, critical minerals, and anything already covered under existing Section 232 tariffs, meaning steel, aluminum, copper, and automobiles taxed under that separate authority aren't taxed twice. What's left, once you strip those exemptions away, is a strikingly specific and almost domestic-feeling list of goods. The alcohol proclamation covers 61 separate tariff subheadings: beer, wine, whiskeys, rum, vodka, gin, liqueurs, and cider, which, according to the Section 338 tracking published by GHY, exists as a direct response to provincial liquor bans that Canada imposed on American alcohol roughly a year earlier, bans that cut you. Alcohol exports into Canada by an estimated 81%. The dairy proclamation, covering 52 subheadings including milk powders, concentrated whey, caseinates, and lactose, responds to what Washington calls discriminatory treatment under Canada's cheese tariff rate quota system. And the Motor Vehicles Proclamation, despite its name according to figures compiled by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, actually sweeps in a huge range of consumer goods beyond cars. Electronics, furniture, building materials like plywood and doors, plastics, clothing, footwear, toys, cosmetics, and agricultural goods like flowers and seeds. Reporting from the specialty outlet Tariff Stool, tracking the individual Federal Register notices, confirmed the list also reaches into cement, fishing rods, and the detail that gave the story its viral headline, hockey sticks and other hockey equipment. It's worth pausing on why hockey sticks specifically became the symbol of this entire dispute. There's no economic logic that makes hockey equipment a strategically significant product category in a trade war between two G7 economies. But symbolically, taxing Canadian hockey sticks lands differently than taxing, say, industrial ball bearings. U.S. News reported that the White House itself described the tariff list as ranging from wine to hockey sticks to cement, almost as if the administration understood the cultural resonance of hitting a sport so closely associated with Canadian national identity. Coverage from the Wire report noted the tariffs introduce real new supply chain costs for hockey equipment manufacturers that rely on Canadian production facilities, a detail with actual economic weight buried inside what otherwise reads as a punchline. Timing matters here too, and it's worth being precise about it rather than assuming a single tidy cause. According to reporting from Kiowa County Press, the tariffs were announced just days after wildfire smoke from Ontario blanketed much of the northeastern United States, and President Trump had separately threatened additional tariffs tied to that smoke over the preceding weekend. A senior administration official explicitly denied any connection, telling reporters on a call, in comments reported by the same outlet, that these were not so-called wildfire tariffs, and that the wildfire issue remained a separate matter, still under consideration by the president. Net News reported that Trump did not raise the new tariffs at all during a private conversation with Prime Minister Mark Carney the day before the announcement at the 2026 World Cup final, a meeting U.S. officials characterized afterward as not primarily about trade. Whether that timing was coincidental or not, the practical result was the same. Another jolt of uncertainty landing on top of a year that Canadian businesses had already spent absorbing one tariff shock after another. To understand why Washington frames this specifically as a response to Canadian retaliation, you have to go back to the broader arc of the trade war. Canada was one of the first countries hit when Trump returned to office in January 2025, and it spent the following year building up its own set of countermeasures: tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and automobiles, provincial bans on U.S. alcohol sales, procurement restrictions favoring domestic goods, and a series of retaliatory surtaxes layered on through 2025. In August of that year, Prime Minister Carney partially de-escalated, announcing that Canada would remove its retaliatory tariffs on any U.S. goods compliant with the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, effective September 1st, while explicitly keeping its counter-tariffs on American steel, aluminum, and autos in place. That partial rollback is exactly what U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer now says is not enough. Speaking to reporters at the Iowa State Fair, in comments reported by Bloomberg, Greer said Canada needs to scrap its remaining retaliatory trade measures against American products to avoid the new Section 338 tariffs entirely, specifically calling out the provincial bans on U.S. alcohol sales, Canada's dairy quota structure, and its procurement rules as issues that must be addressed. In a companion CBC News report on the same remarks, Greer put it even more bluntly: if a country retaliates against us, we're obviously not going to tolerate that. We'll take action. He added that his sense was that Canadian officials wanted, in his words, a more conciliatory approach before adding, "but we'll see." There's a specific irony in the phrase Greer used, "we'll see," because it echoes almost exactly the posture Canadian officials have taken publicly throughout this entire round of talks. Constructive language, paired with a refusal to commit to anything concrete before a deal is actually signed. That mirrored caution on both sides is arguably why the talks have survived this long without a second collapse like the one that followed the Reagan ad controversy last October. Neither government wants to be the one that visibly overplays its hand in public, given how quickly a single provocative statement, an ill-timed advertisement, or a leaked negotiating position derailed the relationship the last time tempers flared. That "but we'll see" is where things currently stand, right up to the moment this script is being recorded. As of Monday, August 17th, 2026, 2 days before the tariffs are scheduled to take effect, Canada and the United States have not reached a deal. According to a live updating account from CP24, published earlier today, Canada's negotiating team met again with Greer in Washington this morning. Greer offered reporters only a curt no comment on his way out, while Canada U.S. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, emerging shortly after, told reporters simply that the two sides were going to continue working. That meeting followed a video call the previous day, Sunday, between LeBlanc, Canada's chief trade negotiator Janice Charette, and Greer, which a spokesperson described, according to reporting compiled by the U.S. and Canada intelligence brief, as constructive. It was, by that point, the fourth meeting between LeBlanc and Greer in 3 weeks. An extraordinary pace of diplomacy for a relationship that, not long ago, looked frozen entirely. That freeze is worth remembering because it shows how quickly this relationship can swing between cooperation and collapse. Back in October 2025, the government of the province of Ontario ran a television advertisement funded at a reported cost of up to 75 million Canadian dollars, using audio from a 1987 speech by President Ronald Reagan warning against the dangers of tariffs, timed to air during the World Series. According to CNN's coverage at the time, Trump reacted by terminating all trade talks with Canada within days. Then, after the ad ran a second time, announcing an additional 10% tariff on Canadian goods on top of everything already in place. Al Jazeera's review of the historical record found the individual lines used in the ad did appear in Reagan's original 1987 speech, though rearranged into a different order than he actually delivered them, a technical dispute that both governments argued over publicly even as the diplomatic damage set in. It took months for talks to fully resume after that episode. The current round of negotiations, by contrast, has moved at a genuinely fast clip, which itself is a data point about how much both sides now have riding on avoiding another rupture. There's a structural reason for that urgency that goes beyond the Section 338 tariffs themselves. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, the trade framework underpinning the entire relationship, is simultaneously up for review. According to the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, CUSMA's built-in extension deadline fell on July 1st, 2026, and passed without the two governments agreeing to extend it, which pushed the deal into a formal annual review process instead of a clean renewal. That timing is not a coincidence from Washington's perspective. The law firm Fasken, writing about a separate but related Section 301 investigation into forced labor practices across 60 economies, including Canada, noted plainly that the threat of additional tariffs may become a key source of American leverage, specifically because it lands in the middle of the CUSMA joint review, giving U.S. negotiators multiple simultaneous points of pressure to extract concessions from Ottawa, rather than one isolated dispute to resolve. Those layered pressures are exactly why Canadian officials have been careful, in their public language, not to suggest this is a fight they can simply wait out. The Globe and Mail, citing sources familiar with the private discussions, reported that Charette directly warned her American counterparts that if the 50% tariffs actually take effect on August 19th, it could halt the trade talks altogether, treating the deadline itself as a form of leverage rather than something to simply absorb. According to the same reporting, Greer acknowledged that warning and recognized the domestic political pressure the new tariffs would create inside Canada, particularly for industries in Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec, provinces already dealing with existing Section 232 tariffs of 50% on steel and aluminum, 25% on autos, and 10% on lumber, according to figures cited in the same Globe and Mail piece. One source told the paper that a Canadian retaliation would almost certainly provoke a further counter-retaliation from Trump, escalating the trade war even more, which is precisely the kind of spiral both governments say, publicly at least, that they'd prefer to avoid. There's a broader accounting question hovering over all of this, too, one that professional services firms advising businesses on both sides of the border have been trying to answer in real time. Doane Grant Thornton, in guidance published for its Canadian clients, laid out the practical reality bluntly. The new 50% tariffs would apply to goods that currently qualify for duty-free treatment under CUSMA, cutting directly against the trade agreement both governments are simultaneously reviewing, and businesses in the affected sectors needed to start reassessing supply chains, pricing, and contracts well before the August 19th effective date, rather than waiting to see how negotiations played out. Macmillan LLP's analysis for its clients went further, cataloging just how far the motor vehicles proclamation's product list actually extends beyond cars, reaching into raw materials and finished goods across the textile and apparel supply chain, including silk, wool, cotton, synthetic yarns, technical textiles, ropes, and carpets, alongside a similarly sprawling list of food and beverage inputs like honey, hops, seaweed products, and baking mixes. The sheer breadth of that list is itself a strategic choice. By touching dozens of unrelated industries simultaneously, the tariffs create pressure from a far wider swath of the Canadian business community than a narrower, more targeted action would. On the American side, the anticipated effects aren't limited to Canadian exporters either. Newsweek's analysis, citing a 2026 Federal Reserve research note, pointed out that tariffs imposed throughout 2025 had already contributed to higher core goods prices for American consumers, with the effects compounding over several months rather than appearing all at once, a pattern likely to repeat if this new round of duties takes hold. A White House spokesperson, Kush Desai, defended the administration's approach in comments to Newsweek, arguing that the evidence showing the tariffs are working is strong. pointing to what he described as trillions of dollars in investment commitments and renegotiated trade deals as evidence of success, and stating that the administration intends to keep addressing what it calls long-standing unfair trade practices affecting American industries and workers. Newsweek also noted a less obvious risk for the U.S. side. If Canadian retaliation causes Canadian retailers to switch away from American suppliers or scale back orders, U.S. farmers, distillers, and food manufacturers could lose Canadian sales even without Canada imposing a single new tariff of its own, simply by redirecting purchasing decisions elsewhere. A softer, but still economically meaningful form of countermeasure that wouldn't necessarily show up in a formal government announcement at all. So, has Canada's countermove actually landed? As of this recording, the honest answer is not yet. And it's important to be precise about that rather than overstate it. What has happened is that Canadian officials, at multiple levels, have made clear that retaliation remains firmly on the table if no deal is reached. Prime Minister Carney told reporters following a meeting with Canada's 13 provincial and territorial premiers in Charlottetown, in remarks reported by CBC News, that everything is on the table depending on the outcome of the negotiations, and that if the new tariffs or other measures come into force, there's a full range of things that we can do. That same CBC report noted real disagreement among the premiers themselves about how aggressive that response should be. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has pushed for a harder line, including reportedly floating the idea of withholding Canadian potash and oil exports as leverage, comments he framed in characteristically blunt terms about wanting to dismantle the American negotiating position, while other premiers have favored the more conciliatory posture that LeBlanc and Charette have projected in Washington. A Canadian official, speaking to the Globe and Mail on condition of anonymity, reiterated Carney's own language, saying all options remain on the table for retaliation. But as of the most recent reporting available, no specific new Canadian retaliatory package has been formally announced or implemented. What has landed, separately, is a piece of domestic economic news that Ottawa is framing as part of its broader strategy to reduce reliance on the United States, even though it isn't a direct tariff response. On Monday, the same day trade negotiators were meeting in Washington, Prime Minister Carney traveled to St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, to join that province's Premier, Tony Wakeham, and Quebec's Premier, Christine Frechette, for what their offices billed as an announcement on energy security and economic development. According to CBC News reporting, the announcement centers on a new agreement between the two provinces' hydro utilities over the Churchill Falls Generating Station in Labrador, a facility they've jointly owned since a contract signed in 1969, with sources describing significantly expanded electricity sharing arrangements between the two provinces as part of the deal. It is not, in itself, a tariff countermeasure, but it lands squarely within a broader Canadian narrative, one Carney has pushed since taking office, of building out internal east-west energy and trade infrastructure, specifically so the country is less exposed the next time Washington decides to use tariffs as leverage. That narrative connects to a bigger structural point worth making clearly. This isn't the first tariff fight of the Trump-Carney era, and Section 338 isn't even the only active legal channel the administration has used recently. Separately from these tariffs, on the July 23, 2026, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office finalized a different action entirely. Section 301 tariffs, stemming from an investigation into whether 60 economies, Canada among them, were failing to adequately enforce bans on goods made with forced labor. According to trade compliance guidance from the customs brokerage firm GHY, Canada landed in the more lenient 10% tier of that action, which took effect July 24th, layered on top of existing duties for any Canadian goods that don't qualify for the CUSMA exemption built into that particular tariff. Products already covered under Section 232, steel, aluminum, copper, autos, and lumber, were excluded from the forced labor tariff, the same way they're excluded from the new Section 338 duties. The upshot is that by the time this script is being recorded, Canadian exporters are navigating potentially 3 or 4 overlapping tariff regimes simultaneously, depending on the product. Section 232, sectoral tariffs, the new Section 301, forced labor duties, and, if no deal is reached by Wednesday, the Section 338 duties on alcohol, dairy, and the sprawling motor vehicles list that somehow includes hockey sticks and cement, but not a single car. Behind all these tariff schedules and legal statutes are actual businesses on both sides of the border bracing for impact, and their reactions tell you as much about the stakes as any government statement does. CBC News spoke with Joey Walsh, who runs a hockey equipment company called Hockey Stick Man and gets roughly half his business from American customers, about the looming tariff. We've been down this road time and again, and it's so frustrating, Walsh told CBC, capturing a fatigue that's become common among Canadian exporters after more than a year of shifting trade rules. The president of Dairy Farmers of Canada offered a similarly weary reaction in the same CBC report, saying of the recurring tariff threats, in essence, that it never seems to let up. On the American side, the reaction from industries that stand to lose Canadian customers has been just as pointed. Chris Swanger, chief executive of the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, said in comments reported by Yahoo Finance that American spirits had effectively been pulled from store shelves across much of Canada for roughly a year and a half as what he called collateral damage in a trade dispute that had nothing to do with the spirits industry itself, adding that his organization had hoped the issue could be resolved without further escalation rather than through a new round of tariffs. The underlying numbers explain why alcohol became one of the three specific pillars of the Section 338 action. According to a White House fact sheet cited by the Linwood Times, Canadian imports of U.S. alcoholic beverages fell by roughly 81%, or about $582 million, between March 2025 and February 2026, compared with the same period a year earlier. After all but 2 Canadian provinces and territories halted the purchase, distribution, or retail sale of American alcohol entirely. The same report noted that Ontario's Liquor Control Board alone pulled and put into storage close to $80 million worth of American alcohol product during that stretch. It's worth being precise about causation here. Those provincial bans were themselves a retaliatory response to earlier rounds of U.S. tariffs, meaning the alcohol proclamation targets a countermeasure Canada adopted defensively, which Washington is now treating as the discriminatory act, requiring a response of its own, a kind of tit-for-tat loop that's been repeating in different forms since early 2025. There are also 2 technical details buried in the legal text of the July 20th proclamations that matter more than most casual coverage has emphasized, according to the trade tracking site Tariff Calculator 2026. First, unlike some earlier rounds of tariffs, goods that qualify as originating under CUSMA are explicitly not exempt from this particular 50% duty, a break from the pattern that had, until now, mostly shielded CUSMA-compliant trade from the worst of the tariff war. Second, unlike the short-lived Section 1 and 22 global tariff that expired in late July, the Section 338 duties carry no built-in expiration date at all. They remain in force indefinitely unless a future presidential action modifies or revokes them. Separate tracking from RefDesk. SKA put the precise scope at 554 individual tariff lines covering the roughly $20 billion in affected goods, a granular detail that underscores just how deliberately and specifically this action was constructed, sector by sector, rather than applied as a single blunt across-the-board rate. It's also worth remembering how this entire chapter connects to the biggest legal defeat the administration suffered all year. Back in February 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that a completely different law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, did not authorize the president to impose tariffs at all, striking down both the earlier fentanyl-related tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China, and the broader worldwide reciprocal tariffs from April 2025. Kiowa County Press's coverage of the new Section 338 tariffs noted this connection explicitly, pointing out that Trump's unprecedented global tariffs from that period, imposed in April 2025 under the 1977 International Economic Emergency Powers Act, were found illegal and overturned by the court. What the Section 338 and Section 301 actions represent, in that light, is the administration methodically working through the list of alternative legal authorities still available to it after the Supreme Court closed off EPA as an option. Section 338 in particular is notable precisely because it had gone essentially unused for the better part of a century, a sign, as several trade lawyers have noted in coverage of the decision, of an administration actively searching statute books for tools that haven't yet been tested in court, now that its fastest and broadest tool has been ruled unconstitutional as applied. Where does that leave Ottawa's negotiating position, practically speaking, heading into Wednesday? Better than it might appear from the tariff percentage alone, according to some economists, but genuinely uncertain in the near term. The $20 billion at stake in the Section 338 tariffs, while real money and a real threat to specific industries, dairy processors, distillers and vintners, cement producers, furniture makers, hockey equipment manufacturers, represents a relatively narrow slice of the roughly $380 billion annual trade relationship between the two countries. The much larger and more damaging tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber were imposed under Section 232 months earlier and remain unaffected by whatever happens with this specific August 19th deadline. That's precisely why some analysts view the current standoff less as an existential threat to the Canadian economy and more as a test of whether Ottawa can hold a firm line on a comparatively contained dispute without triggering the kind of broader escalation, the one Globe and Mail sources warned could follow any Canadian retaliation, that would put the far larger CUSMA relationship at risk. There's also a political dimension inside Canada that shouldn't be glossed over. The disagreement between Ontario's Doug Ford, pushing for a harder retaliatory posture built around Canada's potash and oil exports, and the more measured negotiation-first approach favored by LeBlanc and Charette in Washington reflects a real and ongoing debate inside Canadian federalism about how confrontational the country should be with its largest trading partner. Ford's position carries weight because Ontario is home to much of Canada's auto manufacturing and industrial base, sectors already absorbing Section 232 tariffs. But a harder line also risks the kind of counter-retaliation that could hit those same sectors even harder. Carney, for his part, has tried to hold a middle path publicly, repeating the same line he's used for more than a year now, quoted by Bloomberg. Canada will not accept a bad deal, a statement carefully worded to signal firmness without committing to any specific retaliatory action before one is actually necessary. So here's where things genuinely stand, as precisely as the available reporting allows. The tariffs signed on July 20th are real, legally in force, and scheduled to take effect at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, August 19th, 2026, covering roughly $20 billion of Canadian alcohol, dairy, and the sprawling motor vehicles product category that includes everything from cement to hockey sticks. Whether they actually take effect as scheduled, get delayed through an 11th hour agreement, or get replaced by some interim framework, the kind of partial deal the Globe and Mail has reported both sides are quietly working toward, in which Canada would agree to a list of American demands in exchange for tariff relief, remains genuinely unresolved as of this recording. Canada's countermove, in the sense of a formal new retaliatory tariff package, has not been announced or implemented as of Monday, August 17th. What has landed is a firm public posture, Carney's insistence that everything remains on the table, Charette's direct warning to Greer that the deadline itself could freeze the talks, and a Canadian government working simultaneously on domestic economic diversification, like the Churchill Falls energy deal, as a longer-term hedge against exactly this kind of pressure recurring again in the future. To be fully transparent about sourcing on a story moving this fast, the core facts about the Section 338 proclamations, their scope, and their exemptions come from named legal and trade compliance sources, including Butzel Long, GHY International, and Al Jazeera's review of the White House fact sheet. The details on the current state of negotiations, including direct quotes from Trade Representative Greer, and the reported warnings from Canada's chief negotiator, come from Bloomberg, CBC News, and the Globe and Mail, all citing named officials or sources with direct knowledge of the talks. Anything describing what Canada might do if talks fail, specific retaliatory measures, the potash and oil suggestions attributed to Premier Ford, or the shape of any final deal, should be treated as under discussion, not decided, since no final agreement or retaliation package had been publicly confirmed by either government as of the time this script was written. Given how quickly the situation is moving, with a deadline now less than 48 hours away, some of these details may already have changed by the time you're watching this. So, with the clock now running out on this deadline, what's your read? Does Canada hold firm and risk the tariffs landing on Wednesday, or does Ottawa fold on some of its remaining retaliatory measures to get a deal done in time? Let us know what you think in the comments. One more piece of context worth leaving you with. This is not a story that ends cleanly on Wednesday, regardless of what happens. Even in the best-case scenario, where LeBlanc, Charette, and Greer manage to land some kind of interim framework before the deadline, the underlying CUSMA review remains unresolved, several Section 232 sectoral tariffs remain fully in place, and the Section 301 forced labor duties continue layering additional cost onto Canadian exports outside the sectors covered by any near-term deal. In the worst case, where the 50% tariffs do take effect Wednesday and Canada responds with the kind of retaliation Carney has said remains on the table, both governments have already signaled, through officials speaking to the Globe and Mail, that a further round of escalation would likely follow almost immediately. Either way, the pattern of the past 19 months suggests this will not be the last chapter in this particular trade relationship, and it's unlikely to be the last time an oddly specific product list, this time built around hockey sticks, wine, and cement, becomes the headline through which a much larger and more complicated dispute gets told.